And so we should avoid at all those exclamations that put the Lord's name and his mystery in a very banal fashion. The second commandment also forbids the breaking of promises that we make in invoking God. For example, vow is a promise made to God, and vows are certainly can be made. We have our baptismal vows, we have our confirmation vows, have wedding vows, we have vows that by virtue of the virtue of religion, in justice, we have to keep. And to make a promise and to invoke God's name as a witness and not to be faithful to that is against the second commandment, and it's also particularly against justice and the virtue of religion, justice owed to God. And to make a vow or to invoke God's name, for example, in an oath, to make a false oath, is very serious sin against the second commandment. That a person invokes the Lord's name, for example, in court, and lies under oath, and calls God to witness and to bear witness to a lie, in a certain sense, is making God a liar. And that's perjury, a very serious sin against the second commandment. Also blasphemy, speaking words of disdain, of hatred toward God, toward Jesus Christ, toward the Blessed Virgin Mary, the saints, the church, holy realities in the church, would be blasphemous. And of course that is condemned by the second commandment and would be a sin against the commandment. The second commandment also would forbid the use of the Lord's name in vain, particularly with regard to using the oaths, false oaths, flippantly, for the sake of, for example, giving in to oaths that are false, committing, signing an oath, or pledging oneself to an illegitimate government, where we wouldn't be obliged, but we'd be obliged to avoid taking an oath that would put us out of communion with the church, or would vie with the church for its legitimate authority. For example, St. Thomas More, we're familiar with the story of St. Thomas More, who failed to sign the oath. He wanted to sign the oath as a loyal son of Henry VIII as his chancellor, and yet because the oath put Henry VIII as supreme head of the church in England, he knew he couldn't sign it because it was a false oath. And of course it cost him eventually his life as a martyr of the church. So we have to be very careful that our speech should always be in accord with what is sacred and what is true. Jesus did say in Matthew's Gospel in the Sermon on the Mount, he says that you have heard it said of old that you should not swear falsely. He says, but I say to you, this is Matthew 5:33, I say to you, do not swear at all. And traditionally that has been interpreted in the sense of St. Paul. We know St. Paul, for example, both in Galatians and in his letter to the Corinthians, calls God in a very solemn way to be a witness that what he has written is true by virtue of God, and I call God to my stand that what I have written to you is true. So Paul does make oaths and calls in the name of God, and is not being disobedient to Jesus' words in the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus is condemning not only false oaths, but he says all speech should be in the presence of God, and say yes when you mean yes, and no when you mean no. And so to be realizing that God is present to me, and God is already my witness, even though I'm not invoking it. In certain situations, an oath is legitimate, for example, in court, when it's very important with deciding the future of someone's life, that God be invoked as a witness, and that's legitimate. But to make an oath and invoke God for a lie, or for some criminal practice, or having made an oath and not to fulfill it, would be sinful and against the second commandment. These would be false oaths, or oaths that are not intended to be kept. But also we have to be very careful, as the Catechism points out, that it should be rare that we make oaths at all. For example, the Catechism cites the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius in his section on the second commandment, where St. Ignatius says in his exercises, do not swear whether by the Creator or any creature except truthfully, means it has to be the truth. Secondly, of necessity, that it is required in its necessity. So oaths should be rare. And with reverence, always with the reverence for Almighty God that you're calling to be a witness to that which you are articulating. And so it does legitimize, our tradition has always legitimized the legitimacy of oaths and promises, but never when it's flippant, when it's untrue, or when it is something that is not intended to be kept. So next time we want to move and look at the third commandment about keeping holy the Sabbath day, and take a look at that both from the positive aspect of our duties and sins against that third commandment.
Thank you, Father Champagne. Coming up next, in a conversation with Bishop Michael Jarrell, Monsignor Richard Green interviews Bishop Jarrell about Labor Day.
Good morning. Thank you for allowing Bishop Michael Jarrell of the Diocese of Lafayette and myself into your home for another conversation. Bishop, thanks for being with us.
Thank you. I enjoy being here.
Tomorrow, the first Monday in September, America celebrates Labor Day. It's not a religious holiday, but labor has been the subject of church teaching for some time. And so, Bishop, the first question, what does the church have to say on the subject of labor?
Well, Labor Day is usually about the wage earner, those who are paid by the hour. Sometimes we distinguish labor from management. Management would be the owners and the managers of businesses and corporations and factories and so forth. Mm-hmm. But labor would mean the wage earner. And the purpose of the Labor Day is to recognize the importance of the workers. So that's how that came about. With regard to the church began reflecting on the idea of labor and the economy and so forth in the 19th century. With the rise of the modern industrial state, industrial nation, where you began to get factory workers and owners, and then you had the rise of communism and socialism, all these things going on. And the church was trying to find Christian principles, some way to address these major ideas with Christian principles. And the church really got involved in 1890 when Pope Leo XIII published his encyclical that he called Rerum Novarum in Latin, meaning of new things, because this industrial nation was a new type of reality. And the church was trying to engage that and to put Christian principles to work. So he simply named his letter Of New Things, and the new thing was the industrial state.
Okay. Well, Bishop, without going into the whole history of Catholic social teaching, what are some things the Catechism of the Catholic Church says about work?
Well, I selected a few things it says about work. First of all, that work is a duty. The church quotes, the Catechism rather, quotes St. Paul's letter to the Thessalonians, and St. Paul said, if anyone will not work, let him not eat. Mm-hmm. So that old statement is quoted often, and it sounds very harsh, but it should not be misused, because St. Paul said, let him who will not work, in other words, who wills not to work, who could be working, but he chooses not to, okay? So on the positive side, it's a statement that those who are healthy and who are able to find a job have a duty to work. But we shouldn't apply it to everyone who is not working, because there's some people who are disabled, but there are also some people who want to work but can't find a job.
Yes.
So we have to be very careful of how we apply those words. So that's one thing, work is a duty.
Okay.
Another thing that the Catechism says is that work can be redemptive and even sanctifying. And we're reminded that Jesus himself worked as a carpenter with his Father, and that the church celebrates this in various ways. For example, May 1st is the memorial of St. Joseph the Worker,
Yes.
reminding us very clearly that work is a duty and that it is something that ennobles and strengthens and sometimes even sanctifies human beings. And I think one other thing about work that I'm saying is that work is an opportunity to serve other people. Most jobs provide some kind of service to the community. If you're building a bridge or a road or harvesting crops, this helps other people. And sometimes it gives us an opportunity to evangelize. By the way workers live their lives and do so honestly, and perhaps even speak of Christ in the workplace, they have a great opportunity to evangelize their fellow workers.
Bishop, over the years, labor unions from time to time have been controversial. And so what does the church say about labor unions?
Yes, this has a long history of the church speaking about labor unions. The Catechism of the Catholic Church says that the laborers have a right to form unions, a basic right. It also states that strikes are legitimate when they cannot be avoided. Now we know, of course, that historically some unions have abused their power, have become bullies, and the church certainly does not condone these excesses.
Yes.
However, the basic right of workers to form union is something that the church says they have.
Bishop, another question on a different, slightly topic is unemployment is a big problem in our country today.
Yeah.
What does the Catechism say about this subject?
Well, it's interesting that the Catechism mentions that and says, and I'll quote, "Unemployment almost always wounds its victim's dignity and threatens the equilibrium of his life." That seems like a fairly obvious statement, but what is interesting is that the Catechism does indeed address it and talks about the harm that it can bring to the person and his family. It is a very serious subject.
Bishop, what can we do about unemployment?
Well, I'm not sure. It seems like there are such larger forces at work that we can't really control. I think we can pray for a stronger economy. I think we can fund our local charities that help people who are unemployed. One factor in the current situation has been the housing bubble, where there was greed and fraud at work, so we can pray for virtue among people.
Okay. Bishop, do you have any closing thought?
Well, I remember a saying with regard to Catholic social teaching, "An honest day's work for an honest day's pay." It reminds us that owners and workers, and as well as the state, have obligations, and working these out is quite a challenge. But we call for honest work and for fair pay.
Thank you, Bishop, and thank you for joining us. Have a happy Labor Day.
Thank you, Bishop Gerald and Monsignor Green. Bishop Gerald is always eager to share the Catholic faith with everyone. We hope this program has allowed you to grow closer to God and the Catholic faith. We hope you've enjoyed our program because it is produced for you. So please join us next week on this station as we tell the people about the Diocese of Lafayette and the good news of our Catholic faith.